Okay, let's unpack this a bit. Have you ever really stopped to think about how often we define ourselves by who we're not? You know that old saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend? It kind of hints at it, right? How much our own identity, our alliances, are shaped by distinguishing us from them.
Absolutely.
Today, we're diving deep into some fascinating analysis tracing how this very concept, the other, has, well, evolved through Western history. We're talking ancient times, right up to the mid-20th century.
And it's truly fascinating stuff. What the sources show is that this isn't just some casual thing we do. It's described as a fundamental category of human thought.
Right.
Simone de Beauvoir actually called it that, you know.
Yeah.
Otherness is a fundamental category of human thought, this primal split between the self and the other.
So our mission here for this deep dive is really to follow that thread, to see how different communities time and again define themselves against whoever they saw as outsiders.
And looking at the philosophical shifts, the social changes, the politics behind it all.
Exactly. It's almost like a shortcut, isn't it? To understanding how these core Western ideas, things like goodness, liberty, reason, even civilization itself, were often hammered out in opposition to something or someone else.
Forged in contrast.
Yeah. So let's kick off our journey, maybe way back in ancient Greece. That's where the term barbarian first popped up. And what's really striking, I think, is where it came from. Originally, it just meant someone whose language you couldn't understand, someone who just sounded like they were babbling bar, bar, bar.
Right, unintelligible speech. But that simple linguistic difference, well, it became the seed for something much, much deeper, didn't it?
It did. How did that happen?
Well, initially, if you look at the archaic period, say in Homer's Iliad, the Greeks and Trojans, they had pretty similar customs, actually. The really stark others back then were more like, you know, mythological monsters, Cyclops, things like that.
So it wasn't an immediate cultural judgment.
Not nearly as sharp. The sources suggest the big shift, the real turning point, seems to be around the 5th century BCE.
Oh, okay. What was going on then?
Two huge things. The rise of Athenian democracy and, maybe even more critically, the Persian Wars.
Yeah.
That conflict, 490 to 479 BCE, was massive.
And that's when the Greeks started seeing themselves differently.
Very much so. They framed it as this defense of liberty, their liberty, against what they saw as barbarian despotism, the Persian Empire.
You can even see that in their culture, right? Like in place.
Absolutely. Aeschylus's tragedy. The Persians is a prime example. It portrays the defeated Persians as, well, luxurious, effeminate, servile.
Yeah.
Basically everything the Greeks saw themselves not being. They contrasted it with their own austerity, bravery, and love of freedom.
So they were defining Greekness against Persianness.
Precisely. It became explicit. Euripides has a line in Iphigenia in Alice that basically says it's right for Hellenes to rule barbarians, not the other way around, because barbarians are slaves and we are free.
Wow, pretty blunt.
And then philosophers like Plato and Aristotle kind of codified this. They argued the Greek was the unique political animal capable of living in a free polis, while the barbarian was either this sort of isolated individual or just part of an enslaved mass.
So Greek virtues were literally defined by the perceived vices of the other.
That's the core idea emerging here, yes. Freedom versus slavery, reason versus despotism.
Okay, but history doesn't stand still. What happened during the Hellenistic period? Alexander the Great's conquests must have shaken things up. That rigid Greek-barbarian split, did it hold?
It definitely got more nuanced. Alexander's empire stretched across diverse cultures, and that binary started to, well, blur.
How so?
The key shift conceptually was this idea that maybe Greekness wasn't just about blood or descent. It can be about culture.
Ah, so participation.
Exactly. Civilization and virtue rather than descent determine who counted as Greek. That's a major takeaway. So Greekness became something you could potentially achieve through assimilation, through adopting Greek culture and language.
But wait, assimilation, that sounds like a one-way street.
It absolutely was.
Yeah.
It wasn't about mutual respect or recognizing the value of other cultures. It was an invitation to the other to join the self, but only by shedding their own identity. The terms were still set by the dominant Greek culture.
Okay, so the self still holds the power to define who gets included.
Precisely.
Now, what about the Romans? They picked up a lot from the Greeks. Did they just copy this barbarian idea?
They inherited it, definitely. They used barbarian for groups outside the empire, Gauls, Germans, Parthians, you name it.
Yeah.
But the Roman approach had a different flavor. It was less about inherent cultural virtue.
And more about
Law.
Yeah.
Legal status. That's the profound shift with Rome. The Roman self was fundamentally defined by citizenship, by legal rights and privileges within the empire.
So being good meant being Roman citizen.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And the other, like a peregrinus, the legal term for a non-citizen living under Roman rule, wasn't necessarily seen as inherently vicious, but as an object of Roman law. Their fate, their rights, were subject to the state's decisions.
That sounds quite systematic, a blueprint for formalizing power differences.
You could definitely see it that way. It institutionalized the other within a legal framework.
Okay, Rome's power eventually waned, But as it did, a new, incredibly powerful form of othering emerged, didn't it? Tied to religion.
Yes, absolutely. With the rise and spread of Christianity, the primary other shifted. It became the non-Christian.
The infidel.
Exactly. That term comes from the Latin infidelis, meaning unfaithful. Defining Christian identity often involved defining it against those outside the faith.
And this wasn't just about external groups.
No, it became deeply embedded. Thinkers like Augustine of Hippo, in his work The City of God, took it to a metaphysical level. He essentially reframed all sorts of conflicts, social, political, as part of this grand cosmic struggle between the earthly city of unbelievers and the heavenly city of God.
So the other could literally be your neighbor, a spiritual enemy.
Precisely. It laid the theological groundwork for centuries of conflict, where difference in faith was seen as a fundamental, almost existential divide.
And we see the brutal results, like in the Crusades. Muslims, often called Saracens, were heavily demonized as infidels who were polluting holy lands.
A classic example.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just external. Medieval European societies also turned inward, didn't they?
You mean groups within Christendom?
Yes. Think about the persecution of Jews, often horrifically vilified with labels like Christ killers, or the suppression of heretics Christians who held beliefs outside the accepted doctrine.
Creating a persecuting society, as some historians call it.
Right, and paradoxically, persecuting these internal others often served to strengthen the sense of community and shared identity among a Christian majority. It solidified that us versus them mentality, heavily defined by religious belonging.
So fast forward a bit, the Renaissance, the Age of Discovery. Europeans encounter even more unfamiliar peoples across the Atlantic, in Africa, Asia, and the label often applied was
savage, a term loaded with connotations of wildness, lack of civilization, brutality.
But amidst all this labeling, one thinker, Michel de Montaigne, did something pretty radical back in 1580.
He really did. In his essay of Cannibals, he wrote about the indigenous people of Brazil people. Europeans had absolutely branded as the worst kind of barbarians.
And he flipped the script, didn't he?
Completely. He asked basically, hold on, who are the real barbarians here?
What was his argument?
He pointed out that we tend to call anything we're not used to barbarous. He heard firsthand accounts and suggested that, yeah, maybe these Brazilians ritually ate parts of their enemies, but was that morally worse than the ways Europeans tortured and killed people in their own wars and religious conflicts?
A very uncomfortable question for Europeans at the time.
Hugely. He argued these so-called primitives had their own form of civilization, lived according to natural laws, maybe even in a state of greater purity. It was this early, powerful dose of cultural relativism.
Planting the seed that maybe the other isn't just a negative reflection, but could be equal or even morally superior in some ways.
Exactly, a real challenge to that established hierarchy.
Okay, then came the Enlightenment, championing big ideas like universal human nature, universal rights, reason, science for everyone.
Figures like Diderot even imagined Tahitians questioning European morals.
So you'd think this would be a major blow against othering, right? Finally moving beyond us versus them.
You would think so, and in some ways the potential was there. But here's where it gets really interesting, and frankly, quite ironic.
How so?
While the Enlightenment talked universalism, it simultaneously created new ways to other people.
Wait, how did it do both?
Well, barbarism wasn't just about foreigners anymore. It became the label for anything the Enlightenment saw as backward, superstitious, irrational, including Europe's own feudal past. Voltaire, for instance, othered pre-Enlightenment Europe.
So the very idea of progress needed a backward other to define itself against.
Precisely. Progress required rejecting the barbarous. And this raises that really troubling question. Can the pursuit of reason itself somehow inadvertently lead to new forms of exclusion, maybe even its opposite?
And this wasn't just philosophical, it bled into science. Or what passed for science then.
Oh, absolutely. This is where we see the beginnings of so-called scientific racism. Late Enlightenment thinkers, people like Linnaeus and Blumenbach, started classifying humanity into distinct races.
Which sounds neutral, like classifying plants.
But it wasn't.
Yeah.
It implicitly and sometimes explicitly created hierarchies, usually with Europeans positioned at the top.
And this fed into theories about societal development.
Yes, the stadial theory became very influential, especially out of the Scottish Enlightenment. It proposed this linear progression for all societies, moving from savagery through barbarism, finally up to civilization.
Guess who was at the top?
European civilization, naturally. And you can see immediately how useful this was. It provided a kind of intellectual justification for colonialism and for denying rights to people deemed stuck in earlier stages.
Like saying savages weren't ready for liberty.
Exactly. They were seen as needing guidance, needing to be brought along the path to civilization. Lewis Henry Morgan, an American anthropologist, laid this out very clearly in 1877, dividing everyone into these stages. It effectively became a rationale for conquest.
And this gets even more disturbing when we look at someone like Immanuel Kant, a huge figure in the Enlightenment. He actually codified this kind of developmental racism.
He did, and it's deeply problematic. Kant wasn't just making casual observations. He tried to build a philosophical and pseudoscientific basis for racial hierarchy.
What kinds of things did he claim?
The sources point to what are described as straightforwardly repugnant commitments. For example, alleging that indigenous Americans had no culture or that black people possessed only the culture of slaves.
How did that fit into his philosophy?
Well, for Kant, culture wasn't just art or customs. It was a deep moral concept linked to the ability to set and pursue your own ends, your own goals. So if he claimed certain racialized groups were incapable of setting their own ends, he was essentially saying they lacked full moral worth in his system.
So his racism wasn't just a side prejudice, it was baked into his core ideas.
The analysis suggests it was central, not some unfortunate aberration. And tragically, this provided a kind of high-minded intellectual cover for later, cruder forms of scientific racism, things like measuring skulls, craniometry, and eventually social Darwinism.
Before we get fully into that darker period, you mentioned Hegel earlier. His ideas about self and other seem really relevant here, even though he wrote before things got quite so extreme.
Yes, Hegel's dialectic from the early 19th century offers a fascinating lens. He wrote The Phenomenology of Spirit in 1807.
Right, the idea that encountering the other is actually necessary for knowing yourself.
Exactly. His famous master-slave parable, or maybe better term Lord Bondsman, illustrates this. It's complex, but the core idea is that self-consciousness isn't formed in isolation, it's relational.
How does the parable show that?
Hegel argues each consciousness seeks recognition from another. In the parable, the master seems dominant, but their identity depends entirely on being recognized by the slave. The master doesn't get genuine, equal recognition. The slave, however, through working on the world, through labor, actually develops a sense of independent self-consciousness.
So it's this dynamic, codependent relationship.
Precisely. The other isn't just someone to oppose, but someone necessary for the self to fully realize itself. Even in conflict, the self needs the other to become defined. It's a crucial philosophical insight as we head into a century where opposition becomes incredibly sharp.
Okay, so let's move squarely into that 19th century. You mentioned nationalism and colonialism really kicking othering into high gear.
They were incredibly powerful forces. Nation-states were solidifying, and a key way to build that internal unity, that sense of us, was to cultivate a distinct national identity.
Often by contrasting us with them neighboring nations, maybe, or minority groups within the borders.
Absolutely. One historian put it quite starkly, the need to have an enemy and opposition was absolute and real. Whether it was defining oneself against the savage overseas or against the perceived threat of, say, the Ottoman Empire on Europe's borders.
Having an outsider help unify the insiders.
It served as a powerful unifying force. And tragically, this period also saw a major resurgence of anti-Semitism across Europe. Jewish communities were increasingly scapegoated and stigmatized as this kind of internal other, fundamentally not belonging to the nation.
And then there's imperialism reaching its absolute peak, fueled by these ideas of superiority.
Oh, completely. Think of Kipling's White Man's Burden. This idea, however patronizing or self-serving, that Europeans had a duty to go out and civilize the rest of the world.
Which, of course, rested on viewing non-Western societies as fundamentally lesser childlike, barbaric, stagnant, degenerate.
Exactly. And this connects to Edward Said's hugely influential work, Orientalism.
Right, his analysis of how the West constructed this idea of the Orient.
Yes, primarily the Middle East and Asia. Send argued that Western scholars, artists, and writers created this image of the Orient as this exotic, mysterious, but ultimately backward and irrational place.
The mirror opposite of the rational, progressive West.
Precisely. And Said's crucial point is that this wasn't just innocent fantasy. It was deeply political. By defining Eastern cultures as stagnant, irrational, maybe sensual, but ultimately weak, Western powers could more easily justify their colonial domination and intervention.
So knowledge itself became a tool of power.
Absolutely. Orientalist scholarship, filled with tropes about harems and despots, helped the West assert its authority, define itself by negation, and feel justified in trying to restructure the Orient according to Western ideas.
And we see this in the language used by colonial powers.
All the time. You have French and British administrators talking about their colonial subjects in Africa or Asia as if they were children needing guidance. The Russian Empire did something similar, branding Muslim peoples in Central Asia as barbarians who needed Russian rule to become civilized.
Sometimes reinforced visually, right? Like paintings.
Yes, the Russian painter Vasily Vereshchagin did a series in the 1870s called Barbarians, explicitly portraying Turkestani people as cruel and cunning, justifying the Russian presence. And all this was underpinned by those pseudoscientific theories we mentioned, like social Darwinism, arguing that conflict and competition between superior and inferior races were just natural laws.
It's a bleak picture leading into the 20th century. And then things got even worse.
They really did. The early 20th century saw the culmination of this escalating othering in truly horrific ways.
Yeah.
World War I and World War II unleashed demonization on an unprecedented global scale.
Wartime propaganda just went into overdrive, didn't it?
Completely. It became standard practice to explicitly dehumanize the enemy. In World War I, you had British and French posters depicting Germans as barbaric Huns. German propaganda, in turn, painted the Allies as cruel and merciless.
And this only intensified in World War II.
Oh, dramatically. Especially the racialized propaganda. American propaganda often portrayed the Japanese as subhuman, ape-like figures. Japanese propaganda did similar things regarding Americans and Europeans. It was us versus them, weaponized on a terrifying global scale right up to 1945. But the absolute most horrifying peak of this whole trajectory has to be Nazi ideology.
Taking that ancient idea of the internal other to its most extreme conclusion.
To genocidal extremes. The Nazis targeted Jews, Roma, Slavs, people with disabilities, political opponents, homosexuals, defining them not just as outsiders but as existential threats, as life unworthy of life, needing to be eradicated for the health of the nation, the master race.
Driven by this toxic brew of racial pseudoscience, conspiracy theories, paranoia.
Yes. The Holocaust stands as this absolutely chilling demonstration of where defining a group as a complete other, totally outside the bounds of moral consideration, can lead. It's perhaps the darkest abyss Western othering ever reached.
The sheer scale of that barbarism, coming from Germany, a nation considered at the heart of civilized Europe, it must have forced some serious reflection after the war ended.
It absolutely did. A profound moral reckoning. As one analysis puts it, the sheer absurdity of such a Manichaean, black and white, good versus evil worldview became obvious after the Second World War and the Holocaust. Any claims Europeans had to innate moral superiority were just shattered.
And thinkers started to question the foundations of Western thought itself.
Yes, critically. European intellectuals, particularly those of the Frankfurt School like Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, who had fled Nazism, wrote Dialectic of Enlightenment around 1944. They turned the spotlight back onto the Enlightenment itself.
Arguing that the Enlightenment's focus on reason wasn't entirely benign.
Exactly. They argued that the very drive for rationality, for control over nature and society, contained a hidden dark side, a potential for domination and dehumanization. The tendency to categorize, control, and ultimately cast the other as less than human wasn't just an error. They saw it as a kind of pathology potentially lurking within Western reason itself.
Which circles back to that question. Can the pursuit of reason somehow turn into its opposite, into barbarism?
A deeply unsettling question that emerged from the ashes of the war.
So, bringing this all together, tracing this long history of the other from ancient Greece to the mid-20th century, what's the big takeaway for us looking back? It seems like a profound paradox.
It really is. On one hand, it seems undeniable that our identities, whether we're talking personal identity or group identity, national, religious, cultural, have been consistently shaped, forged even, through opposition to some perceived other.
We define us by defining them.
Time and time again, that pattern repeats. From the Greeks defining themselves against the barbarians, to Christians against infidels, to nations against rivals, to the Enlightenment civilized versus the savage or backward, it seems almost structural. Without the other, the self seems to struggle to know its own boundaries, its own values.
Our virtues, our ideas of goodness, liberty, reason, they often seem to crystallize in contrast to what we reject or fear in the other.
That contrast seems crucial to the process.
Which leads to some pretty uncomfortable questions for us today, doesn't it? Like, does our sense of good actually need an enemy to exist? Could our identity, our cohesion as a group, somehow falter if we didn't have an other to define ourselves against?
These are fundamental questions, and philosophers and psychologists were grappling with them even before the mid-20th century cutoff of our discussion today. But it's also crucial to remember this isn't just one long, unchanging story of hatred.
That's a good point. There were countercurrents, moments where the circle expanded.
Absolutely. Think about the Stoic philosophers in the ancient world advocating for cosmopolitanism, seeing all humans as citizens of the world. Or Christianity, despite its own history of exclusion, introducing the idea of a universal brotherhood under God. Or the Enlightenment's concept of universal rights, even if it was applied selectively at first, the idea was there and eventually fueled movements for greater equality.
So moments that implicitly shrank the space for dehumanizing the other.
Yes. And we can also look critically at the politics of othering. Ask yourself, who actually benefits when a particular group is cast as the other? Very often, it's those in power trying to unify their own base, distract from internal problems, or justify exploiting or dominating the other group.
Recognizing that dynamic seems key.
It's a vital first step towards maybe dismantling it.
So this deep dive shows this almost constant, often violent tendency in the West to affirm that having an enemy helps define goodness. It's this powerful dialectic shaping identities across centuries.
It is. But the challenge emerging from this history, perhaps, is whether we can evolve beyond it.
Can we build identities, personal, national, global, that don't require enemies? Can we learn to see difference not primarily as a threat, but maybe as, well, as Hegel hinted, something necessary for understanding ourselves more deeply?
That's the ongoing challenge, isn't it?
So maybe the final thought for you, the listener, is this. The next time you encounter that us versus them framing, pause for a second, take a deep dive. Ask yourself, what does that them really represent for us? What does it reveal, maybe uncomfortably, about our own identity? And how might we start building a sense of self, a sense of community, that doesn't fundamentally rely on having an adversary?